Greetings, my name is Keith Lewin. I work at the University of Sussex at the Centre for International Education. I have been running a RPC for the DFID on research on educational access, transitions and equity, otherwise known as CREATE. In this session I'm going to be talking about financing issues and how it's possible to square the circle of providing universal access to secondary schooling at sustainable levels of cost. So this presentation is in 4 parts. First of all, I'm going to say something about the key issues in relation to finance on secondary schooling. Secondly, I'll walk you through how you can determine how much resource is needed to universalise access. Thirdly, we will look at some different enrolment challenges in different types of country. And lastly, I'll say a few things about how financing gaps can be met. So first of all, what are the key issues then in financing expanded access? So the first key issue is that mass access to secondary schooling is unavailable at current costs. In sub-Saharan Africa, the cost of secondary schooling is about 4 times on average that of primary schooling per child. And in some countries it's higher than that. At those cost multipliers, universal access is simply not affordable. Costs have to come down to less than twice as much as the level they are per child at primary school. So reforms are necessary that reduce costs without damaging quality. The second is that the rate of expansion will be partly determined by these costs and the affordability. Secondary schooling is expensive, and it's expensive to households as well as to states. In much of sub-Saharan Africa, children from households outside the top 2 quintiles will not be able to afford the direct and indirect costs of secondary schooling. For them, and for children in lower quintiles, secondary schooling must be effectively free, and there must be ways of financing it. Third, the risks of over-rapid expansion are real. It is possible to enrol more children in the existing infrastructure of building. It is possible to increase class sizes and maintain the same number of teachers and maintain the teacher's salary bill. But doing that would be counterproductive. Preferably, systematic approaches are needed which manage expansion at a rate which doesn't degrade quality and does not generate costs which can't be supported. Fourth, though it's true that private and private for-profit providers of secondary schooling can make a contribution to access, they will only really do so for those from richer quintile households. It remains to be seen whether it's possible to run for-profit schools at cost levels which would allow people from the bottom 3 quintiles to attend. Fifth, there are a range of non-financial constraints on growth which are often overlooked. It takes time to train teachers, it takes time to build schools, it takes time to develop curricula which will suit a full range of capability in the population. So whatever the direct financial constraints are, there are also lead times and lag times of the various inputs which are necessary to manage expansion effectively. Most obviously, problems around teacher supply can be a serious constraint. If the output of the existing secondary school system is not sufficient to provide enough students who become graduates who can then be particularly upper secondary school teachers, then this will be a long-term constraint on growth. So, in a nutshell, in terms of some of these issues, it's going to be very difficult to achieve enrolment rates that are greater than about 75% in many sub-Saharan African countries. But it's not impossible, and it certainly is affordable given appropriate reforms in the way in which the school system operates. Cost-saving reforms will be essential to achieve these kind of goals, but they must be coupled with the realisation that for children, for students, and students from the lowest 3 quintiles, the service must be essentially free at the point of delivery. So those are some of the key issues that will surround policy debates about how to expand secondary schooling at affordable cost. Let's now turn to calculating the kind of magnitudes of the resources that would be needed. What are these resources determined by? Well, as with any public accounts and financing of education, the capacity to resource the school system depends on how much tax is collected, the domestic revenue. It depends on how much of that is allocated to the education system as a whole, and within that how much is allocated to secondary schooling as opposed to other subsectors. It depends also on the amount of private spending from households which complements that, which is provided by the state. What can be delivered with that resource depends on a range of things. It depends on the proportion of children of school age in the population. In countries which haven't gone through demographic transition, the challenge is much greater than in countries which have. A high growth, low enrollment country, high population growth, may have 2 or 3 times as many children per working age adult as a post-demographic transition country does. Their task is much more difficult. I've already commented on cost per child of a school place. This is central to the equation as to how much finance is needed to provide universal access, and it varies widely. The willingness to allocate public finance to education and to the secondary school subsector is of course central to the equation, as is the amount of private contribution of one kind or another, which may complement that state funding. Those are the main parameters then that affect the public financing of education systems in general and secondary school systems in particular. If you look at the chart which is now on the screen, you'll see a very simple model which is a reminder how the governments collect a proportion of GDP through their tax systems of one kind or another. In rich countries this may be 40 or 45% of GDP. In some poor countries it's less than 20%. And it's from that proportion that governments finance public services. So as the chart shows, it means that a poor country collecting less tax revenue will have to allocate a greater share of what it does collect to its government to arrive at the same proportion of GDP being spent on education on the right-hand side of the chart. The challenge has a different quality, although ultimately and in the long term, of course, governments must collect sufficient revenue to deliver the services they promise their peoples. To get down to the specific, there is a simple equation which is very useful. It relates the proportion of public expenditure on education as a percent of GDP to the gross enrollment rate, to the proportion of children of school age in the population, and to the public recurrent cost per child of delivering primary or secondary schooling. That equation is on the screen in front of you now, and a simple example shows how it works. Using that equation, you can determine the proportion of public expenditure you need to universalise secondary schooling, since you know the parameters on the right-hand side of the equation. In the case of the example given, 100% gross enrollment rate with 9% of the population being of secondary school age, lower secondary level, and a cost per child of 30% of GDP per capita. In that system, 2.7% of GDP would be required for universalising lower secondary schooling. That's a large number, given that you have to finance the rest of the education system, and few countries would spend as much as that. This very simple equation, therefore, reminds us that even at 30% of GDP per capita as the cost per student, it will be difficult to universalise participation. The worked example that you now see shows you how this might work in practice. The first case which is given there shows a system where the primary school enrolment rate is 90%, the gross enrolment rate. Lower secondary 26%, upper secondary 13%, higher education 3%. With that kind of configuration, with typical numbers for sub-Saharan Africa, for the proportion of the population in the age group appropriate to the school level, and with cost levels as shown, 12%, 30%, 60% for primary, lower secondary and upper secondary, then 4% of GDP would be sufficient to finance that system. If we look at the bottom of the chart though, you see a different system, a system where primary schooling has an enrolment rate of 110%, lower secondary 100% and upper secondary 50%, and higher education taking 5% of the age group. Using this same calculation, we arrive at a conclusion that 6.6% of GDP would be necessary to finance that system. The chart makes it obvious that the variable which is easiest to change is the cost per child. Those costs per child have to be in a range which is sufficient to arrive at a total figure for the allocation of GDP to education to be realistic, and in reality of course countries rarely spend more than about 6 to 7% on education. So whatever is to be achieved has to be achieved within those limits. And let's move on then and present this in a slightly different way. The chart that you're now looking at aggregates patterns of enrolment in different countries in sub-Saharan Africa. They fall into 4 types. Type 1 are high enrolment countries where pretty much every child who starts reaches grade 9 and indeed in some cases reaches grade 12. In the second group of countries there is some over-enrolment in terms of enrolment rate in grade 1, and by the end of primary schooling there are about the same number of children enrolled as there are in the population. Above that level in the secondary grades there are fewer children in school and a way to travel to reach full enrolment. Type 3 countries have a lot more children in grade 1 than there are in the population of 6-year-olds, but alongside this have high attrition rates with a lot of dropout, such that by the secondary school grades less than half the age group are likely to be enrolled. And the fourth group of countries don't have as many children in school in grade 1 as there are in the population of 6-year-olds. So these are 4 different scenarios that create 4 different financing challenges. Where there is over-enrolment in primary school, the opportunity is there to regularise entry and flow so that the system is not full of children who are overage and repeating. Some of the savings that result from that could be transferred to provide more places at secondary school within the same total resource envelope. In high enrolment countries, the challenge is likely to be not financing more enrolment, but financing higher quality. And in those countries where the transition from primary to secondary is less than universal, it's clear there is a challenge both to increase participation and finance additional capacity, but also, and at the same time, will be the challenge of improving quality and ensuring that curricula are relevant to the needs of new students. 4 examples of those country types are given in the chart which is now in front of you. South Africa has high enrolments. It spends more per child than any other country, any other large country in Africa. But in terms of measured achievement, it certainly doesn't get as much as it should in terms of learning outcomes. It's a system which has high attrition after grade 10, but below that, the great majority of children do have access to schools and to secondary schooling, although the cycle is not strongly differentiated in South Africa. Kenya, the pattern is different and the challenge is clearly different. Finance will be needed to increase capacity at the secondary school level by a factor of at least 2 and possibly more. In Mozambique, the situation is different again, where there is clearly a lot of over-enrolment in the lower grades with overage children and repeaters. resources are being consumed at that level which could be used to expand access to secondary schooling, and there is a long way to travel in the higher grades to reach the line of the number of children of the age for the grade, which is represented by the green dots. In Mali, the distance to travel is even further. At every grade there are fewer children in the system than there are in the population. And a different balance may need to be struck in terms of investment in expanded secondary schooling and the rate at which this takes place in Mali, given problems on the supply side and the number of children who are reaching the level of entrance to secondary school. For very different cases, a reminder that the financing challenges and their solutions will be very different. So let's move on to the last sequence of comments on financing expanded secondary schooling in this section. There are a few rules, or a few rules of thumb, which I think prove useful. Cost per student as a proportion of GDP per capita need to be somewhere in the range of 15% or less at primary school level, 25% or less at lower secondary level, and 40% at upper secondary level, for a system to be able to provide universal access at affordable cost. Though there is some room to manoeuvre on the margin with those figures, a departure which is more than small will create equations which mean that unrealistic proportions of GDP would have to be allocated to the education system. As I've already said, another rule of thumb is that cost per secondary school student should generally be less than twice those at primary level, and even 50% and more is probably both possible and desirable. This does not mean degrading quality, it simply means being more efficient in using the resources that are available and asking hard questions about why it should be that secondary schools are much more expensive than primary schools, when the main costs are in teachers' salaries. And the general principle should be that effective teachers are being paid fairly similar amounts, whether they're working with primary or secondary school students. Teachers' salaries are, of course, a very important part of the cost equation and the largest element. Another way of looking at this, derived from the equation that I've been discussing, is that teachers' salaries at primary school level cannot be much more than about 4 times GDP per capita, or at secondary level about 5 times GDP per capita, for the financing to be sustainable within an envelope which is realistic. Alongside that, the contribution made by for-profit fee-paying schools is unlikely to be much more than about 20% of enrollment and 20% of the nominal costs of providing universal access. The reasons for this go back to teachers' salaries on the one hand and household incomes and their distribution on another. The details are too complex to elaborate here, but that is the conclusion that many people would reach, that as systems develop, somewhere between 20 and 30% of enrollment is probably the upper limit for fee-paying, self-financing private schooling. Teacher class ratios need to be less than 2 to 1. Some secondary school systems are very inefficient in the sense of having more than 2 teachers available for every class which is currently being taught. It's not only the pupil-teacher ratio that matters, it's also the teacher-class ratio that matters in terms of what is delivered and how much teachers have time on task. And the last couple of rules of thumb, which I think may be useful, is that wherever possible, of course, cost recovery options should be used, but coupled with pro-poor subsidies. Secondary school systems generally are regressive. They're inhabited by children from upper quintile households more than lower quintile households. It is appropriate, where it is possible, to operate various kinds of means-tested fee structures, payment structures, which encourage those who can afford to pay to make a contribution. But it's not appropriate to apply flat rate fees across a population because these will exclude. Pro-poor subsidies are necessary, and services which are free at the point of service delivery are essential if expanded access is to be equitable. The last rule of thumb, based on experience, is that the growth rate in participation in secondary schooling should not be more than GDP growth plus perhaps 5%. To sustain higher rates of growth for any length of time is to challenge the capacity of systems to grow, adapt and maintain their quality, to provide sufficient physical resources and to supply schools and facilities with an adequate number of trained teachers. So those are the rules of thumb, I think, that can inform some of the planning that may take place, which can construct models of financing within national envelopes of domestic revenue and government allocation which are believable and sustainable. When we model the financing gaps to universalise secondary schooling across Africa, the numbers we come up with are typically between $10 and $20 billion annually on the recurrent side. That seems like a big margin, but of course there are many uncertainties and it depends what assumptions you put into the modelling. These financing gaps can be addressed, and any country that spends more than 5 or 6% of GDP per capita on its education system with an appropriate cost structure can find ways to universalise access through to the end of the lower secondary cycle, and in some cases through to upper secondary. The options available, of course, are in one sense fairly obvious, but need to be worked through in the context of different national economies. Real economic growth, of course, increases domestic revenue. You can increase the proportion of GDP allocated to the education system, and you can change the subsectoral allocation. There are some countries which spend more on their university system than on all their secondary schools. This cannot be right. It should be possible to develop progressive funding systems that do seek to capture more of the cost of provision from those who can afford to pay in the top quintile or the top 2 quintiles, and transfer the benefits of subsidised places to those who can't afford to pay from the bottom quintile households. It is, of course, also possible to address the financing gaps by attracting greater volumes of external assistance. But as with many other kinds of aid, this should always be coupled with clear pathways forward, which use the opportunity of external assistance to catalyse change towards a sustainable model of financing that sooner or later requires no external assistance. The last set of options to close financial gaps which appear when trying to plan increased access to secondary school are the most important. They have to do with increasing internal efficiency and reducing costs per student. There's not one way of doing this, but many. It is true that far more children could experience secondary schooling at affordable levels of cost if secondary school systems were more efficient. The range of options to achieve increases in internal efficiency and reduce cost per student is wide. The challenge is to locate within each system the opportunities that exist to make better use of teachers, to make more intensive use of facilities, especially where these are specialised and expensive, to use the opportunities of new learning technologies to increase the effectiveness of the scarce resource of the trained teacher, and to look again at the sources of cost to household and see how they can be minimised so that secondary schooling is more affordable to a much greater proportion of the population.